Hello and welcome to our webinar. I'm David Halfpenny from Shearwater Solutions, a cyber CX company. With me via video chat today is Marvin Oka. Marvin is an international consultant, author and recognised expert in behavioural modelling and behavioural change technologies. He specialises in the areas of leadership, organisational culture shaping, leadership communication, strategic thinking and systemic change. Born in Hawaii and now living in Australia, he's a stage magician and Aikido expert and has worked with researchers and rabbis. Marvin joins us today to talk about cybersecurity and how to deal with cybersecurity's weakest link, people. Welcome to Shearwater, Marvin Oka.
Oh, thanks, David. It's quite an honor to be here, and I'm very excited about our conversation today, especially as the application of behavioral modeling, which is my area, into such an intriguing field like cybersecurity.
Well, I think we're at the point in cybersecurity maturity that behavioral modeling is where we need to be at. It's been an evolving field over the past 10 or 20 years. Now it's just absolutely exploded worldwide. And one of the areas that we're missing is that whole psychology thing, that the people side of cybersecurity. So let me set the scene for this discussion, Marvin. Now, in cybersecurity, it's a much debated, uncomfortable and inconvenient truth, and that truth is in quote marks, that people are the weakest link in the cybersecurity chain. Now, by this, we're talking about people clicking on phishing emails, people being socially engineered into giving up information or access to systems, people connecting drives and devices to the network and infecting it with malware, people losing those drives and devices on trains and at airports with sensitive data on it. The list goes on. Now, you're the expert in the behavior area, Marvin. What's going on here?
Okay, that's a great question. Maybe to answer it and to explain the lens or the angle that I'm coming at this from, let me explain a little bit about behavioral modeling and how it's related to, but slightly different than psychology or behavioral psychology in particular. So as a behavioral modeler, what we do is we look at forms of human ability, basically what any human can do. And to keep with the metaphor of cybersecurity, we're sort of like neurological hackers, so to speak. What we do is we try and find out what is it that it's occurring within the central nervous system of the person that allows them to do the behavior that they do, or sometimes not be able to do the behavior that they're supposed to do. And the challenge for this is that all forms of human behavior or human competency require neurological processes occurring outside the awareness of the performer. So they're unconsciously competent. You can't just ask. So for instance, I often ask people to just, as a demonstration, to just wiggle their fingers. And then I'll ask them, how do you do that? And most people can't answer. They basically say, well, you hold up your hand and you wiggle. Well, okay, accurate, but uninformative. What am I supposed to do with that information? We want to know interesting questions like, how did you know, which hand to hold up? Why that high? Why not higher? Why not lower? Why facing this way and not that way? How did you know which finger to go first? How fast? How did you know how fast to wiggle your fingers? How far did you know? How did you know how far down before the next one went? The next one went. And if you stopped, how did you know when to stop? See, all these things are occurring outside your awareness. And so our job is to try and find out what is occurring outside your awareness. Can we language it into a model where we can replicate the behavior? And if we can, then we have a behavioral or a neurobehavioral model. So it's slightly different than just behavioral psychology. So in order to answer your question, in terms of what's going on with humans posing a lot of cybersecurity types of issues, I'll come at it not so much from a straight psychological framework, although that does play a part of it, and not exactly purely just neuroscience either, although that does play a part of it, but from a modeler's perspective. And from a modeler's perspective, I'm going to take a look at it from the angle of, all right, let's say I'm the user. I'm the one who's letting people in, or I'm the one getting hooked into a phishing email, or I'm the one who's talking to a social engineer and I'm giving them all this information, or I'm the one who's just taking a piece of equipment and plugging it into your network and all of a sudden allowing all sorts of malicious downloads to occur. As a modeler, I'd want to ask, well, how is that possible? What has to be occurring for someone between their ears that allows them to actually do this? And there's several things that will instantly come into play. First of all, if we contrast that with someone who does the behavior of good, for lack of better terms, good cybersecurity hygiene, good behaviors to make sure that they're basically they're cybersecurity safe, so to speak. What's different between the two? Well, let's think about this for a moment. Well, number one would have to be something like, as trite as it may sound, first of all, awareness. Am I even aware of what the challenges are? And then secondly, motivation. Do I actually care? Now, this is interesting because a lot of the literature that I've seen in the cybersecurity space, as well as some of the support materials that you've sent to me for me to get up to speed on some of these things, it approaches cybersecurity and it approaches safety, cyber safety, as if we would all be naturally motivated to want to do that. And there's a difference between my agreement. Intellectually, I would agree, of course, we want to do that, versus in the heat of the moment, what are my actual natural motivations? And frankly, I'm only motivated, and any human is really only motivated about things, obviously, that they care about, but also things that have consequences for them, whether positive or negative. And so if we talk about, for instance, how do we make sure that the organization is safe? Frankly, as the end user, I will certainly agree that the organization needs to be safe. But in the heat of the moment when I'm doing a behavior, I'm actually not concerned about the organization. I'm more concerned about my own convenience, my own expediency, my own effectiveness, what my particular need is in that particular moment. And if I'm in a rush and I need to answer an email, then I am clicking on things. It's going to be that pretty straightforward. And so the issue now becomes, in the context of something like cybersecurity, what would motivate me to want to do that? And then as a model, let's take a look at where people naturally do that already. So number one, I know for myself, and I would assume for many of our viewers and listeners, when I leave my home, if I'm going out for the day, for a meeting or go to work or whatever it might be, when I leave my home, I don't leave my door wide open. I close my door and I lock it. I make sure that the house is safe, is secure. When I park my car, I don't leave my car wide open. I make sure that the doors are locked and the windows are up. So why do I do that? But then when I get to my desk, why is it that I'm actually not as vigilant with cybersecurity type issues? Well, number one, with my house and with my car, I have something to personally lose. It's not the organization I'm going to have my house broken in, my things stolen, or my car taken, and so therefore I'm very aware of that. Secondly, I can easily imagine images in my head, pictures, whether I've seen it in other people, I've seen it in movies, or maybe it's even happened to me, where people have broken in or they have taken things from me, and so I have immediate pictures. It's what's called, more than motivation, it's called salience. There's strong neurological relevance and intensity that's going on to these pictures, where I start to recognize, oh, this is important and it has something to do with me. And so therefore, and whether I'm going to lose or whether I'm going to gain, and so therefore I'm going to do this behavior of something like locking up my house or locking up my car. So if you come at it from that kind of a framework, let's now juxtapose that into someone sitting at their desk. Okay, so a phishing email comes. And let's say I've just gone through a cybersecurity awareness training program, and you've told me all about it and how it's important for the organization, and all that's important and wonderful, and I totally agree. And then in the moment, if I don't have pictures in my head that are salient in my neurology, that makes me recognize I personally have something to lose or to gain by not checking if this email is valid or if it's a scam. If I don't have that, well, I'm just going to click. And if the system gets hacked, whose problem is it? At the end of the day, it's either the organization, or worse yet, it's just the IT's department. It's just the security section's department. But it doesn't personally come back and affect me, other than maybe I might lose a couple of emails or whatever it might be. But until there is that personal identification and personalization of the issue, then we can talk all we want, but the actual real motivation is actually not there. And so this is a major issue. So number one, can I even recognize when there's a danger situation? And then B, do I identify with it, and do I have any personal win or lose associated to that? It's going to be a major issue. And until then, people do the behaviors they do.
So how do we get people to have that skin in the game? Look, the most skin you can have in a game is your own skin. And we have the situation with, for the last 20 years, people have been warned about smoking and how bad it is. We know that there's a causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer and various other medical conditions, and yet people still smoke. Now, you talked about immediate pictures and salience, and so this is what I'm assuming is the rationale behind the images on the cigarette packets with the lip cancer and the fetuses and various other things like this, to try to not necessarily scare people off smoking, but give them an immediate indication of what the consequences could be, because the consequences of smoking tend to be 5, 10, 30 years down the track.
Yeah.
So in this situation, how do we get people to have that skin in the game when their own skin is not as valuable to them as we would expect? How does the organisation compete with something like that?
Yeah, okay, you've raised some excellent points here. So number one, yes, short answer is yes. A lot of these types of what looks like scare images, etc., are the attempt, the actual thinking behind it is to actually try and get that, what's called in our particular field, anchoring, in probably more classical psychology, it would just simply be called classical or even operant conditioning, straight stimulus response connections. That, if I can link a really negative images that I don't want associated to something like smoking, then when I think of smoking and I see that image, then theoretically that should give me an aversive behavior. But as you've rightfully pointed out, that doesn't work with everyone, and there's a reason for that. So before I can answer your question of how do we do it, we need to address this issue. In our field, it's what's called secondary gain. And secondary gain is the real motive behind something. And it's often not a pure straight motive. It's often can be convoluted with things like limiting beliefs or other types of strange connections that can start to go on. So for instance, someone might recognize that, oh yeah, okay, so smoking kills. Okay, they might kind of agree with the research on that. They might even see the pictures that look like diseased lungs, etc., associated to smoking. So you have to ask, well, so then how is that not enough? Why would they still smoke knowing that it's going to kill them? And it could very well be that there's a whole range of other beliefs that will come into play. Like for some people, not everyone, but for some people, they might be thinking, yeah, it happens to everybody else, but not me. Now, regardless how valid that belief is or not, if that's what's operating for them, then they've got somewhat of they're somewhat immune. It's less salient. The message is less salient to them. Or they might think, actually, they might have some strange set of beliefs where they start to think, my life is terrible. I hate myself. I'm not a worthy person anyway, so I deserve to die. And so they might still do that for some strange reason. And at which point, at that point, it's not a behavioral issue anymore. It's a psychological one. And we have to address that accordingly. But let's assume that's not what's going on in your typical organization, where someone thinks, well, I'm not a worthy person, so I just as soon have the whole organization infected with some malware. Let's assume we're not going to that level of psychosis. But so let's just assume that, all right, so you've got, for lack of better terms, your typical person, normal person with a normal psychology, whatever that may mean, working in your particular organization. Well, number one, they have to become aware that how much they as a person are responsible for letting in hackers, malware, whatever it might be. And they need examples. They need references. They need to know an example of how individuals do this. But there also needs to be some kind of an accountability mechanism. Now, by accountable, I don't mean a formal punitive type mechanism, but there needs to be some way where, if I'm sitting at a desk, for instance, and out of neglect, I've been told this, I've been trained this, the company's been emphasizing this, and I choose to negate this and not regard it, and I let a hacker in or some malware in off something pretty standard, pretty routine, something I should have caught. Right? Is it traceable back to me? Now, it doesn't mean it formally so, but if I know that at least IT will know it came through me, and I know that, I'm going to be a lot more on guard about this than if, well, I've let it through and oh well, oops, right? But if I know that if I personally let it through, somebody's going to come visit me and ask me what's going on personally, I'm going to be a heck of a lot more vigilant about it. Right? Secondly, without having to name names, you don't want to go that far, right? But if in a report it shows up that we just had a bug let in, etc., has caused a bit of havoc, and it came from this department, the department I'm in, and even though I'm not named, and I know I'm the one who did it, right? I know that, I'm not individually publicly shamed, but there's an accountability. There's a social accountability where I'm starting to think, oh boy, that was me. That's not going to happen again. Let me put it that way. Right? Not by me anyway. So as long as those kinds of structures are in play, then people are going to be more apt to follow, because there's consequences. There's emotional felt consequences to them. And so the other thing too is helping shape their identity on this. That let me give you a somewhat of a lateral example on this. Many years ago, I was working with you'll probably figure it out, but I'll keep them nameless for now, a very large natural resources company in Australia, working in one of their coal mines. And this was not the premium coal mine. This was actually third of their, in terms of grades of coal. And so they didn't get always the greatest resources. They weren't getting the greatest amount of profit per tonnage, because their grade of coal was a little bit less, or quite a bit less than the top grade coal mine. And we were trying to shape a corporate or a mine identity around this. And the tip came from one of the union delegates. And the union delegate said, actually was the second in charge. And he said, look, let's face it. We are at the dog end of the coal seam, right? And he said, we are, and he named the coal mine. We are XYZ coal mine. He said, we have to bring out the mongrel in us. We just have to be leaner, meaner, smarter than all the other coal mines. We have to have mongrel, and we have to have rat cunning. That is who we are. Right? At which point everybody went, yeah. Right? Now, at which point it was really interesting, because after that, there was a heck of a lot less complaints about how tough it was for that coal mine, why they didn't get the benefits that the other coal mines were getting, why they had to work under more adverse conditions than the other coal mine. They actually took it as a badge of honor that they actually had to do things tougher, leaner, meaner, with more rat cunning, because their identity shaped accordingly. Now, if I bring that back to this kind of an issue that we're talking about here, right? If it gets positioned that, someone who lets some things in, some basic, you fell to a basic email scam, or a basic phishing email that if you just even looked, you would have seen some anomalies in the email, or you got taken by not even a very sophisticated social engineer, or something of that nature, or you did something really just classroom 101 baseline thing you should not do. You just took something and you plugged it into the network and you let in some malware. This is like basic thing anybody would know not to do. If it becomes, number one, anybody who does that is clearly recognized as an idiot, right? And if you're at all smart, you wouldn't even fall for those basic fundamental cybersecurity hygiene errors, right? That's really basic. So there's a bit of peer pressure that will now start to go on with that as well. It's in our particular language, it's called a swish pattern, where we have an identity upgrade that starts to occur. If someone can be seen as, I'm not an amateur. I don't fall for basic email phishes. Right? I'm not an amateur. I'm not an idiot. I wouldn't plug in something into the network, that wasn't cleared. Right? Or something of that nature. Only a real beginner amateur would do that. That would be another aspect where my psychology would instantly be running in this kind of thing. So it takes some upgrading and shaping on a lot of this. I think one of the mistakes that a lot of cybersecurity quote unquote education or training does, and it's not them. I see it as well in things like the mining industry, et cetera, where we have safety trainings, right? Safety awareness trainings. I think that they make the fundamental flaw, and it's fundamental because any good educator knows this, right? They make the fundamental flaw thinking that if you know, then you would do. Right? If I can give you content, if I can give you knowledge, then of course your behaviors will change. That never works, right? Anywhere from diets to exercise to, as you pointed out, smoking, to just knowing about it doesn't necessarily cause a behavioral change. We have to have issues around motivation, around values, around identity. We have to link into the current belief structures that people are working with. They do need education and training in terms of content and knowing the right triggers, knowing what to look for. It is a skill at one particular level, and it's if I can go against the grain with a lot of other types of approaches, to me it's a furphy when people blame it on culture, because culture is not a thing. You know, you can't point to culture. There's nothing there, right? Culture is a set of characteristics that arise out of the way we're working together, which is a derivative. It's an emergent property out of each individual's behavior and their relationships to each other. And so you can't blame culture, but what you can bring it back to is everybody's level of self-awareness, self-motivation, and skill sets to be able to work with what needs to happen. Now, having said that, some people, some of your listeners may be familiar with something called the FOG behavior model, but he's not the only one. Also, David McClellan had a similar type of an approach where he talked about the three elements of want to, how to, chance to. FOG talks about prompts, abilities, and motivations. There's different ways to go about it, but there are certain cues that you now need to train people to do. Now, when I say train, I don't mean educate in terms of content. I actually mean setting up the neurological pathways, the neurological connections, what we call anchors, stimulus response conditioning, for people to have in their neurology active. When a trigger happens, more than what I would class as what FOG is talking about with the prompt, but when an actual trigger happens, a response occurs, right? So number one, you can't just tell people about how you can have phony emails, for instance. You can teach them that at the start. Then you actually need to ideally sit them down in front of their computer, because that's the anchor, that's the trigger. Their computer at their desk. You send them a phishing email. You have them look at it. You have them run through a series of questions in their head. Look for the key things to actually look for big things they could look for in a false email. Have them train that a few times. Have it run through their neurology a few times. Now, when they get an email, the trigger happens, the questions will occur, they will look, it's all anchored into their exact straight stimulus response environment, and the behaviors will be there. But you can't just educate the conscious mind and then expect unconscious behavior to actually occur. You actually have to train the unconscious responses. And that's where you're going to have a much more effective kind of a training. I had one colleague, for instance, years ago in safety training. They were, as an example, they were teaching people, they had a lot of incidences where, for some reason with their machineries and things, despite the signs, big signs, do not stick your hand in the machine when the machine is on, right? Lots of cases of people losing fingers and a whole range of things because they stick their hand in the machine. And they didn't know what to do until they had a colleague of mine who was also into behavioral modeling. And he taught them, his training was very different, his so-called education and training. And so his safety training literally took people to the machines, had them start to put their hand up, reach up, and as soon as they saw their hand, saw the imprint of their hand as an image, have a voice in their head that actually said, stop. So they would actually freeze and then say, check, is the machine off? Right? And it's like, if not, bring your hand out. And they would do that several times. And so now the accident response rates just went way down, because what now people were doing is they're in a rush, things are happening. Oh no, the machine's jammed again. Their first instinct is stick their hand up, and it was all triggered in. As soon as they saw the hand, it was already anchored in. It was bang, stop, is the machine off? And they just linked it in. So it's not enough just to train the conscious mind. You actually have to train for unconscious behavioral responses.
Okay, so this is moving away from the traditional awareness training into this behavioural training. I'm going to quote, I'm going to reference a slightly more cynical view and ask your opinion on that. So our new Chief Strategy Officer, Alistair McGibbon, formerly the National Cybersecurity Advisor, head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on cybersecurity. He has said in the past that cybersecurity education for employees has largely failed, and we should instead just focus on the next generation, completely write us off, and focus on the next generation. So are we really in such a hopeless situation? Can we retrain the staff that we have now, or do we have to replace it all with millennials and Zoomers?
What a fabulous question. Okay, there's a couple of things to clarify first up. Number one, whatever he's referring to in terms of cybersecurity training has largely been pretty much failed. And that doesn't mean cybersecurity training carte blanche fails. You have to look at the way it was done and what constitutes training. Like I said, so if the majority of training was awareness training, yeah, I can see why it's not going to work all that well, for all the reasons we've just spoken about. A different kind of a training, a behavioral-based training, would probably work a lot better. It wouldn't be the cure-all, but it would definitely work a lot better. Right? Secondly, going to a whole nother generation, but if you don't change your thinking, I don't know, it's hard to read between the lines as to what he was actually trying to say, but I off the top of my head, I don't see how you could take a training that doesn't work for this generation, do that same training in the next generation, expect it to work. Something else has to change, which means it's not necessarily generational. There's nothing, as a behavioral modeler, I don't see anything that suggests why any particular training would work with another generation compared to this one. What you would need to do is alter the training to fit your audience, to fit who you're actually talking to. You do have to become aware that, that an older generation might not be as aware of some of the technological types of nuances that might be occurring that a later generation who grows up with the technology might be. But at the same time, there are things that they are aware of that a younger generation isn't, for instance. And so, look, as a quick example of this, I did some work with the tax office many years back doing some behavioral modeling projects, and we were looking at the time around the implementation of GST, and we had some of the top senior tax technical advisors, and they were very skilled, kind of similar to checking out email phishing. They were very skilled, extraordinarily skilled at being able to look at a taxpayer inquiry, say it came through an email, and being able to detect what was going on behind the email request, because it's important, because the email requests were asking for private rulings, right, which are binding, legally binding. And so they had to quickly assess, are they trying to convince me to go with a particular type of ruling? Is this someone genuinely asking for real advice because they actually don't know? Is it someone who's professional and they are, in a different use of the word, fishing around to actually find out something of how the tax office is going to rule? They had to try and find out a lot of things, and probably very similar to now detecting email scams. They were looking for little things like the heading, the language patterns. They were looking for the email address as to where it was coming from. They were looking for the formality of the letter, spelling or typos. They were looking for narrative style. They were looking for a range of things before they ever got into the content to try and assess where was the taxpayer coming from, what was actually behind the actual request. And so now the people that were really good at this were not the new generation. They were the older dudes, right, that could actually detect a lot of this. And part of it came out of sheer experience, because they actually understood, if grandma or grandpa was writing me, I kind of know how they're going to language things. If a tax professional is writing me, I know how they're going to language things. I can actually see if someone's not very good at email and they're only used to more traditional forms of snail mail, the way that they would actually formalize the heading of their email, etc. They could actually look at things and kind of quickly understand what your background is, which could only come because they've been around for so many years, right? Now, so there are things that, by the way, at that point, we started to realize that the actual training that was required wasn't just skilling. We actually had to pair up younger generations with older generations to actually make sure that we had a nice balance, so they had a a scope of what they were actually looking at. So coming back to the original question, look, I don't think waiting for the next generation is the answer in almost any form. I do think, no, I don't, your short answer to the question is no, I don't think it's that hopeless, but I think where the finger needs to point is not at the generations, not at the people that are responding or not responding to our quote unquote trainings. We need to point the finger back to ourselves and say, are we doing the trainings effectively? Is you think about it, if someone needed to train you to make sure that your house and your car and your private property was secure, right? If they did it well, you wouldn't be resistant to the training. Of course, I'm going to protect my house and lock it up. Of course, I'm going to protect my car. Of course, I'm going to learn things like how to park my car in a well-lit area compared to a dark area, right? That's to my advantage. I want to know that, right? I want to know that it's safer to walk on the side of the street where there's light compared to the side of the street where there's bushes and darkness and hidden, pockets and things of that nature. I want to know that it's safer to walk down this part of the city compared to this part of the city. You only need to tell me once, and I've got a vested interest to want to do this. And it's probably not the fact that it's my generation. It has more to do with, is your training actually talking to my psychology and what's relevant to me? And so I can appreciate his frustration that past trainings may not have been effective, but then I suspect that's because the trainings were not effective, not the people. People are people. People are motivated by what they're motivated about. You tap into it, they will do it.
Okay. Now, going back a little bit in our conversation, we were talking about smokers and warning them against smoking, and you gave some quite good reasons why people don't necessarily connect their behaviour with an outcome, a negative outcome. One of the reasons that may be possible there is the whole Deus Ex Machina type of thing, where they believe there's going to be some sort of technological solution to their problem, and so they can smoke and do whatever they want now, because in 10 years' time we're going to cure cancer and we're not going to have to worry about it because medical technology is wonderful. I suspect that there's some of that in the cybersecurity area, or people using technology in general. So what role do we play as cyber experts or IT experts? Can we design technology better to cater for people's disability to connect with cybersecurity practices? I mean, how much of this is our responsibility, and how much is it the people actually using the technology?
Yeah, look, lovely question, and it's something that is part of a lot of outside of IT, also part of just production, the production industries unto themselves, coming back from, back shortly after World War II with total quality control type of movements. So, if I were to go to the obvious examples that probably a lot of your viewers know are things like, there are things where if you want people, for instance, to put on a seatbelt before they drive, one is you can try and educate the heck out of them as to why they need to fasten their seatbelt before they actually start up the car or start driving in their car. Other things is, well, if you're the manufacturer, one of the things that you can build in is a constant beeping that occurs that's going to be really annoying until you actually fasten up the seatbelt. You could try and fasten it up behind you, but that's wildly inconvenient. It's just far more convenient to just put it on, right, and stop the beeping sound. You could even go so far as to make it so that unless the seatbelt is on, the car doesn't even start, if you wanted to go that far. So it's the classic, quality management principle of you build quality in. You don't try and inspect it out. You don't try and inspect defects out. You build quality into the system. And so in some ways, taking that basic principle, then yes, if you know that there are common things that humans will do simply because we're human, and if we can build some things in as much as possible to make it, to build out, to take out those kind of human errors that are most typically going to occur. If we can do that, then we should do that by all means. We should just be smart and do that and help people out. But there is no question that there is also the flip side of the equation as well, which is every user does have their responsibility. You can have, automatically locking doors for your house, for instance, that might be electronically controlled, where you can flip a switch on and off that says my doors will either automatically lock or they won't, right? But it's still up to the human to actually flip that switch on or off, right? It's going to be up to you and your particular motivations. Even now with emails, just basically even off of Gmail, for instance, on Google, will come a prompt every now and then that's saying, "Are you sure you trust this person? They're not in your contact list." So that piece of software, that little thing is built into their email client, and where suddenly it shows up and it just warns me very quickly. But it's still up to me to actually say yes, allow, or don't allow, right? And so unless I'm educated to recognize that this is a very real thing, then I'm not going to. On the flip side of this, aside from Gmail, I think I spoke with you about this in the past around things like LinkedIn, for instance, right? I'm constantly getting LinkedIn connection requests. And every so often I will get, I'm thinking, partly thanks to the modeling project I did with the tax office that I was mentioning about with the email thing, as well as conversations with yourself, David, is since then I've actually gotten about 3 or 4 LinkedIn connection requests where I looked at it and went, it looks fishy, right? Because in the past, I would have just said, yes, you just connect to everybody, right? LinkedIn is a networking thing. Of course, you want to be connected to everybody. Go for it. I even had colleagues just say that. They said, yeah, the connection comes in, just say yes, just accept. And then I started looking, and I've seen 3 or 4 in the last couple of months where you looked and went, it just looks fishy. The image looks fishy. Their bio is really sparse. Right? They might have 1 or 2 connections that we supposedly share, but just some things just don't make sense. And so when I start probing a little bit more, I start clicking on their name and trying to find out what are the contact details I have. Sure enough, some things start falling apart. You kind of go, well, this makes no sense. I had one that supposedly came in. She was somebody that did some kind of IT thing for Walmart in South Carolina or something. And I looked it up, and there was no such division of Walmart in South Carolina. Right? And I went, well, wait a minute. So there's something still on the user side where you still have to be aware, and you still have to track this down. Now, coming back to what we were talking about before, though, why did I do that? Why did I actually bother to look it up? Because I became acutely aware that there is such a thing as LinkedIn connection request scams. And what they will do is they will hack into your data. And then they will not only do that, they'll run havoc on your network, e.g. my network, right? And now I'm taking it personally. Now I'm starting to go, okay, you're not robbing my house. Right? I am locking the door. Right? And so there's a part of me where that personal motivation comes in. Now, if I wasn't aware that could happen to me, then yeah, just accept and, well, what the heck, right? But now that I'm aware, it's like, well, no, I'm not going to let them rob my house. I'm sorry. So while they don't have, while this case LinkedIn doesn't have a thing that just says, hey, this person looks a little bit suspicious. You might want to check whether or not you want to connect with them. Whereas Gmail will go, they're not in your contact lists. Are you sure you want to actually, respond to this email? There are things, obviously, as coming back to your question, there are things that as IT people you can do to build in, or I should say build out human error. There are other things you can do to actually warn against human error, but it's still going to be your particular choice. And then there is no question. There are some people, you're not going to win them all. There are some people where, smoking's going to kill you. And they go, yes, I don't care. And at which point you go, well, okay, they're going to smoke no matter what you do, right? So there's some people we kind of go, well, we can warn, we can help as much as you can, and they just are going to have bad cybersecurity hygiene. At which point, this is why it's also useful if you can track it. If you're an organization and hey, we've got if cybersecurity is critical to our organization, to our business. In fact, it may be for some people, for some organizations, it's a major part of your business model, where what you actually offer is based on how secure your actual offerings are, right? Online or whatever it might be. Especially if you're a financial institution, et cetera. If you have lousy security, your business is gone, right? If that's critical, and you can track, we've had about 12 cybersecurity breaches from this one guy, right? One male or female. This is one where you need to start thinking they are a business risk at this point. You might want to start talking to them about, if cybersecurity is clearly not your thing, you might need a job elsewhere where in a business where cybersecurity is not so important. Yeah.
Okay. So now I'm aware of the time, Marvin, and I know you're extremely busy with all of the consulting work that you're doing. So we'll wrap this up with just asking you one more question, which is around, okay, if I'm going in on Monday morning and I want to make a change in my organization, what's one thing that I can do from a behavioral modeling type of perspective? What's one thing that I can do to make things better in the cybersecurity space?
I would, well, it's hard because everything, we spoke about culture previously. Every culture has its own currency as to what they're going to respond to. So it has to be specific. But if I had to go categorical, without knowing the exact culture of your organization to know what will work in an organization or not in a particular organization, I would suggest, in addition to all the warnings that go on with cybersecurity, motivation has two directions. Motivation has an away from, we're going to avoid penalties, consequences, pain, and we're going to move toward rewards and pleasure. Right? For a lot of people, there is no question. What will actually get people to actually take action is usually more of a move away from. It's usually more of a, unless I do, then I will act. However, even though that's what causes them to act, that's not what causes them to want to engage. And what we want to engage is the move toward. And so if you can actually, again, without knowing the culture and what will actually work, but if I just said as a big, gross generalization, the more you can actually highlight success stories of good cybersecurity behavior, right? It's much more challenging to do, to actually highlight, hey, we got this email scam came in and so at such and such a department found it. Hats off to them. They prevented a huge possible problem for us, right? And then a couple of weeks later, I also hear through your internet or whatever it might be, or just whatever in a corporate newsletter or whatever it might be, hey, so-and-so found, someone prevented someone from logging into this, attaching a device to the network that would have downloaded this huge malware, and we caught it in time. Congratulations to them. And I'm starting to recognize, wow, you actually become a hero and you get recognized for doing the right thing. That's not going to catch my attention. Well, actually, that will not start putting it on my radar. However, what will actually make me actually do it is avoiding the consequences. But you do need both. And if you just emphasize all the problems and penalties, after a while, people switch off because they don't want to hear that anymore. They don't want to hear doom and gloom all the time. So the more you can actually balance that out between, I understand the risks, and I want to be one of those that avoid it. I don't want to be the one that causes the problem. But there's also a bright side where I get celebrated as a hero if I do the right thing. I get acknowledged. I get recognized. People are tracking whether I'm doing the right or wrong thing. That's huge in shaping behavior. It is about behavioral shaping. It is about rewarding what you want and then making sure that there are felt consequences for what you don't want to have happen. And when both are there, people's behaviors do shape.
Now, I think I've said to you before, Marvin, that one of the reasons why I wanted to do this webinar with you is because I can listen to you talk about this sort of stuff all day. It's absolutely fascinating. And I really appreciate the time you've taken to come and talk to me today. So I've been speaking with Marvin Oka, and you can find him at behavioralmodeling.com. I'm going to put it out there to say, look, contact Marvin and his team and have a chat with him about the people side of cybersecurity. I'm sure that you can consult in this space, can't you, Marvin?
Absolutely. Would love to.
For the tech side of cybersecurity, you don't want to go to Marvin. You want to come to us at Shearwater Solutions. So that's shearwater.com.au. Thank you very much once again, Marvin. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, David. Loved it. Thank you so much.